Chapter 7 of How I Know God Answers Prayer by Rosalind Goforth. This recording is in the public domain. How I Know God Answers Prayer. Chapter 7. The Story of One Furlough, 1908 to 1910. Call upon me in the day of trouble. I will deliver thee, and thou shalt glorify me. Psalm 50:15. In the summer of 1908 I was obliged to return to Canada with 5 of our children, leaving Mr. Goforth in China for the revival work. Reaching Toronto, I learned that my eldest son was at death's door, from repeated attacks of rheumatic fever. He was then almost a day's journey away. On my way there, as I recalled the time in which he had been given back to us from the very gates of death, my faith was strengthened to believe for his recovery again. But, as I prayed, it became very clear that the answer to my petition depended on myself. In other words, that I must yield myself and my will to God. I had been planning to take no meetings during that furlough, but to devote myself wholly to my children. I confessed the sin of planning my own life, and definitely covenanted with the Lord that if he would raise my son for his service, I would take meetings, or do anything as he opened the way for the care of the children. There were 6 difficult doors, however, that would have to be opened, not one, but all, before I could possibly go out and speak for Christ and China as God seemed to be asking. First, the Lord would need to restore my son to complete health, as I could never feel justified in leaving a sick child. Second, he would need to restore my own health, for I had been ordered to the hospital for an operation. Third, he would need to keep all the children well. Fourth, a servant must be sent to take care of the house, though my income was so small that a servant seemed out of the question, and only the strictest economy was making both ends meet. Fifth, a Christian lady would need to be willing to take care of the children and act as a housekeeper in my absence from home. Sixth, sufficient money would need to be sent to meet the extra expenses incurred by my leaving home. Yet, as I laid these difficulties before the Lord, I received the definite assurance that he would open the way. My son was brought back to Toronto on a stretcher, the doctor not allowing him to raise his head. But on arrival he would not obey orders, declaring that he was so well he could not and would not remain still. Fearing the consequences of his disobeying orders, I telephoned for the doctor to come at once. On his arrival he gave the lad a thorough examination, and then said, "Well, I cannot make him out. All I can say is, let him do as he pleases." Within a month the boy was going back to his high school, apparently quite well. Some months later he applied for a position as forester under the government. He had to pass through the hands of the official doctor. My son told him of his recent illness, and of what the doctor had said concerning his heart. But this physician replied, "In spite of all you have told me, I can discover nothing whatever the matter with you, and will therefore give you a clear bill of health." As for myself, I did not go to the hospital, for all the symptoms that had seemed to require it left me, and I became perfectly well. A servant was sent to me who did her work sympathetically, as helping me to do the Lord's work. A married niece living near offered to stay in the home whenever I needed to be absent, and so there remained but one condition unfulfilled, the money. But I believed this would come as I went forward, and it did. Each month that followed, as I made up my accounts, I found that my receipts exceeded my expenditures sufficiently to enable me to spend money for work in China, and to purchase things which I needed for China, including an organ. All these accounts were laid before our beloved Mission Board secretary, who approved them. Under these circumstances I dared not refuse invitations to speak. Yet so weak was my faith, for months I never left home for a few days without dreading lest something should happen to the children during my absence. I even accepted meetings with the proviso that if the children needed me I must fail to keep my appointment. But as the days and weeks and months passed, and all went well, I learned to trust. Be still, be strong today, but Lord, tomorrow? What of tomorrow, Lord? Shall there be rest from toil, be truce from sorrow? Did I not die for thee? Do I not live for thee? Leave me tomorrow. In giving the following, I wish to make clear that, had I been living a life of ease or self-indulgence, I could not have been justified in expecting God to undertake for me in such matters as are here recorded. It must be remembered that I had stepped out into a life which meant trusting for everything. Before leaving China for Canada, my husband had said to me, "Do not stint the children with apples. Give them all they want." But when I began housekeeping I found this was not very easy to do. Apples were expensive, and the appetites of my 6 children for them was insatiable. However, I began by buying a few small baskets, and then I did not need to buy more, for apples came in a most wonderful way, first in baskets, then, as the season advanced, in barrels. These came from many different sources, and in some cases long distances, express paid to the door. On one occasion a barrel of large hard greenings came just as we had finished the last barrel. The children complained that they were too hard to eat, and begged me to buy them some snows, very expensive but delicious apples for eating. I had only purchased one small basket of snows when a large supply, almost a barrelful, came from a distant friend. I feel that the Lord saw that I had given up all for him, so just showed how he could provide, thus evidencing his love and care for my dear children. We had set up housekeeping at the end of the fruit season, and so I had not been able to do canning for winter use. That winter, again and again, gifts of canned fruit came, sometimes from unknown sources. Altogether 70 jars of the finest fruit were sent to us. I will give the details of just one of these gifts. Shortly before leaving home for 10 days, the servant informed me that the canned fruit was finished. Accordingly I went down and ordered enough dried fruit to last till I should return. On reaching home I was greeted at the door by a rush from the children, all trying at once to tell me that a lovely valentine had just arrived. Leading me back to the kitchen, they showed me the table covered with 20 jars of the most delicious looking fruit and a large can of maple syrup. On a card accompanying the gift was written, "A valentine for our dear substitute in China, from her sisters in Renfrew." Early in the winter it became evident that a telephone was a necessity with my numerous calls and engagements. I hesitated about going into this expense, not being quite sure that it was right to use in that way the money given me. At last I prayed that the Lord would show me his will in the matter by sending me half the amount needed for the telephone within a certain time, if it was right for me to get it. Before the time expired the money had come, so I got the telephone. As the weather became cold I began to suffer on the long drives in the country to appointments, and was soon longing for a fur coat. I consulted our mission secretary as to whether, if sufficient money were given me, I could put it into a fur coat. The answer was a decided yes. There was no doubt that the coat was a necessity in the Lord's work, so I began to pray the Lord to send the money quickly, for the cold was severe. In less than 2 weeks I received the money needed, and of course got the coat. The ladies of the Winnipeg Presbyterial had arranged a series of meetings for me in Winnipeg, Brandon, and other places in that vicinity, about 10 in all. The collections from the meetings were to defray my traveling expenses, which would amount to over $100. On my way by train from Toronto to Winnipeg I caught a severe cold, which settled in my throat and chest. I did not want the women to be disappointed, and also put to all the expense, if I failed them. Just before reaching Winnipeg I was enabled to commit myself definitely into the Lord's hands, for strength and voice for the meetings. The days that followed can never be forgotten, for the bodily weakness, fever, and throat troubles were removed only while I was giving my addresses. In each case, though so hoarse before and after speaking as to be scarcely able to make myself heard above a whisper, my voice cleared for the address. For example, while at Dr. and Mrs. C.W. Gordon's home, the Sunday I was to speak in Winnipeg, I was advertised to speak that night in Dr. Gordon's church. At the supper table I asked Dr. Gordon if he would be ready to speak should I fail. Just before my time came to speak, I slipped up to the platform behind Dr. Gordon, who was praying, and oh, how I cried to the Lord for help and courage. For the church was packed, and even the Sunday school room partitions were opened to accommodate the crowd. My throat was as if in a vice, and I felt weak and ill. But, as Dr. Gordon introduced me, I stepped forward, possessed by a feeling of wonderful calm and absolute confidence. It seemed I could just feel one like unto the Son of Man beside me, and never had I felt so completely and only a channel. For more than an hour I spoke so that everyone heard distinctly. but when I sat down my throat tightened as before. Dr. Gordon told me later that he had a man sit in the most difficult place in which to hear, and that he had heard every word. So it was till the end of my appointments on the homeward journey. I asked the Lord either to heal my throat or provide a way for me to get a needed rest from speaking, for I had many appointments awaiting me in Ontario. A few days after reaching home, 4 of my children were taken down with measles. During the week I was in quarantine with them, my throat received the rest it needed and became quite restored. One day, the following early summer, in looking over the children's clothes, I found that there was so much to be done I was fairly overwhelmed. I saw it was quite impossible to do the necessary sewing and keep my appointments too. The question that weighed heavily was, should I cancel the meetings for which I had given my word? My husband urged me to buy ready-made clothes, but I knew how expensive they would be, and could not bring myself to do so. I went alone and laid my burden before the Lord, praying that, if he wanted me to speak further for China, he would show his will by sending me some gift that would enable me to get ready-made clothes for the children. A few days later I was speaking at a Presbyterial gathering in Western Ontario. At the close of the evening meeting an old gentleman put into my hands some money. I asked him what he wished me to use it for, and he replied, "For your children. Use it in a way that will help you be free for God's work." My heart rose in thanksgiving, and I decided to accept it as the token I had asked of the Lord. On my return to Toronto I spent this gift in buying ready-made clothes for the children, to save my time and strength for the Lord's work. When busy in my home one day, the thought of 2 dear friends in the China Inland Mission kept coming constantly to mind, and I began to wonder if I should not send them some money. Looking into my purse, I found I had only 50 cents on hand. I put the matter out of my mind, with the thought that if the Lord wanted me to send them anything he would provide a way. That afternoon's mail brought a letter from a distant place in Ontario where, a year before, I had visited and spoken for a friend. The letter was from the treasurer of the Christian Endeavor Society for which I had spoken. He enclosed $5 and said the money was to be given me at the time I spoke for them, but had been overlooked. My first thought was to return it, as it would be dishonoring my friend to accept money for such a service, and then I remembered my friends for whom I wanted money, and decided to send the $5 to them. My husband, returning the following morning, handed me another 5 to put with it, and the $10 was sent off. In due course a reply came from my friend, saying that the very morning my letter arrived they both had been given assurance that a certain sum would come, for which they had been praying. This was to meet a need which they did not wish to bring before their board. My letter brought the $10, and another letter in the afternoon's mail contained a sum which, with mine, exactly made the amount they had been asking the Lord for. Say not, my soul, can God relieve my care? Remember that Omnipotence hath servants everywhere. On one occasion, when about to leave home on a 10 days' trip to Montreal and other places, word came that the children's Sunday school treat was to take place during my absence. Little Mary had no "best" dress for the occasion. I had planned to make her a white woolen dress, but now there was no time, and I knew I could not make it while away, with so many meetings ahead. But the very day a lady from our church called and said she wanted for a long time to help me, and asked if she could do any sewing for me. With dim eyes and a grateful heart I accepted her offer. On my return Mary told me of her wearing a pretty white cloth dress for the Sunday school treat. Once more we planned to leave Canada for China, and a serious problem faced me. Our oldest son could be left to face the world alone, but not our daughter of 16. It was necessary that a suitable guardian be found for her. I called on 3 different ones whom I thought would feel some responsibility toward the missionary's daughter, but all 3 declined to accept the responsibility. I then saw that it was not for me to try to open doors, but for this also I must look to the Lord. I prayed that, if he wished me to return to China, he would send me one to whom I could commit her. A short time passed, then a lady called, whose life had been devoted to the training of young women. Her beautiful Christian character made her the one above all others in whose care I could gladly leave my daughter. This lady told me that in her early years she had hoped to give her life for service in China, but the way had been closed. She now felt that the Lord had laid it upon her heart to offer to take charge of my child. Years have passed since then, and she has fulfilled my highest expectations of her. Rarely has a more definite answer come from a loving Father, nor one that brought greater relief and help, for this offer, coming as it did in answer to my prayers, seemed to be unmistakable proof that the Lord would keep my child as I gave her up. The time had almost arrived for beginning the last preparations for the long journey to China, when one day Ruth came in from her play with her heavy coat almost in shreds, she having in some way torn it on a barbed wire fence. The coat was the only heavy one she had, and I had planned to make it do for the ocean voyage, intending to get a new one in England. I tried to find a new one in the stores, but the season was past and I could not, and had no time to make another. I just took the need to the Lord and left it there, believing that in some way he would provide. A few days later a friend telephoned me that her mother had recently returned from a visit to Chicago, and wished me to come over to see a parcel she had brought for me. Oh, the relief that came when I found that the parcel contained, among other things, a handsome red cloth ulster, which fitted Ruth perfectly. This fresh evidence of the Lord's overshadowing care touched me deeply. Those who have never known such tokens of the Lord's loving care in the little things of life can scarcely understand the blessedness that such experiences bring. Whether it be so heavy that others cannot bear to know the heavy burden they cannot come and share, whether it be so tiny that others cannot see why it should be a burden and seem so real to me, either in both I lay them down at the Master's feet, and find them alone with Jesus mysteriously sweet. As I attempt to recall the answers to prayer in this furlough, so many come to mind it is impossible to record them all. Help in keeping my appointments, courage and power for public speaking, physical strength and guidance in facing many difficult problems. It was at this time I formed a habit of getting a message for a meeting on my knees. It often seemed to me very wonderful how, as in a flash sometimes, an outline for a talk on China would come. Never having kept notes, nor even outlines of addresses, I have frequently been placed in circumstances when I have felt utterly cast on the Lord, and I can testify that he has never failed to give the needed help and the realized divine power. Yet sad, sad is it that often at just such times, no sooner would the address be ended than the Satan-whispered thought would come, I have done well today. Oh, is not the goodness and forbearance of our God wonderful? Wonderful that he ever again would deign to give help when asked for it? A short time since I asked a dear friend whose writings have reached and inspired multitudes throughout the Christian world, how did you do it? Softly, with deep reverence in look and tone, she replied, "It has been done all and through prayer." With deepest gratitude and praise to our ever faithful God, I too can testify that any little service I have been able to do has been done by his grace in answer to prayer. I stood amazed and whispered, "Can it be that he hath granted all the boon I sought? How wonderful that he for me hath wrought!" "O faithless heart," he said that he would hear, and proved his promise, wherefore didst thou fear? How wonderful if he should fail to bless expectant prayer with good success. End of chapter 7. The story of one furlough. Chapter 8 of How I Know God Answers Prayer by Rosalind Goforth. This recording is in the public domain. How I Know God Answers Prayer. Chapter 8. Our God of the Impossible. Behold, I am the Lord. Is there anything too hard for me? Jeremiah 32:27. Ah, Lord God, there is nothing too wonderful for thee. Jeremiah 32:17. Margin. The following illustration of the truth, what is impossible with man is possible with God, occurred while we were attending the Keswick Convention in England in 1910. One evening my husband returned from an evening meeting, which I had not attended, and told me of a woman who had come to him in great distress. She had been an earnest Christian worker, but love for her light, trashy fiction had grown so upon her as to work havoc in her Christian life. She had come to Keswick 3 years in succession, hoping to get victory, but had failed. My whole soul went out to the poor woman. I longed to help her, but Mr. Goforth did not know her name, and the tent had been so dark he could not recognize her again. Besides, there were about 4,000 people attending the convention, That night I lay awake asking the Lord if he knew I could help her to bring us together, for I too had at one time been almost wrecked on the same rock. 3 evenings later the tent was so crowded that I found difficulty in getting a seat. Just as the meeting was about to begin I noticed a woman change her seat twice and then rise a third time and come to where I was, asking me to make room for her. I crowded the others on the seat and made room for her, I fear not too graciously. While Mr. F.B. Meyer was speaking, I noticed she was in great distress, her tears falling fast. I laid my hand on hers, and she grasped it convulsively. At the close of the meeting I said, "Can I help you?" "Oh no," she replied, "there is no hope for me. It is those cursed novels that have been my ruin." I looked at her in amazement, and almost gasped. "Are you the one who spoke to Mr. Goforth Saturday night?" "Yes, but who are you?" Scarcely able to speak for emotion, I told her, and also of my prayer. For the next few moments we could only weep together. Then the Lord used me to lead the poor crushed and broken soul back to himself. As we parted, a few days later, her face was beaming with joy in the Lord. When addressing a gathering of Christians in Glasgow, I was giving a certain incident, the point of which depended upon a verse of a certain hymn. When I came to quote the verse, it had utterly slipped my memory. In some confusion I turned to the leader, hoping that he could help me out, but he said he had no idea what the hymn was. Turning again to the people, I had to acknowledge that my memory had failed me, and, feeling embarrassed, I closed my message somewhat hurriedly. Sitting down, I lifted my heart in a cry to the Lord to lead me to the verse I wanted, if it was in the hymn book used there. I took up a hymn book and opened it, and the very first lines that fell upon my eye were those of the verse I wanted, though it was the last verse of a long hymn. Rising again, I told the people of my prayer and the answer, and gave them the verse. The solemn stillness which prevailed indicated that deep impression had been made. Some 2 years after, a newly arrived missionary in China told me how he had been present at that meeting, and how this little incident had been a great blessing to him. They cried unto thee, and were delivered. They trusted in thee, and were not confounded. Psalm 22:5. Before leaving Canada, we had written to the China Inland School at Chefoo, China, hoping to get our children admitted there. But shortly before we left England for China, word reached us that both the boys' and girls' schools were overflowing with long lists of waiting applications. This was a great blow to me, for I had been looking forward to engaging once more in the aggressive outstation work. But the children could not be left, and were too old to be taken away from their studies. It seemed necessary, therefore, that a good Christian governess should be found, who would teach the children and take charge of the home in my absence. All the way across the Siberian route this matter was before us. Earnestly did I pray that the Lord would direct the right one to us, for I knew that to get a young woman who could fill the position we wanted her for would be very difficult in China. We had planned to go direct to our station, but illness forced us to break the journey at Peitaiho, where we met a young lady, the daughter of a missionary. Many difficulties appeared in the way of her coming on with us, but one by one these were removed, and when we continued our journey this young woman was one of our party. Time proved her to be truly God given. Not only was she all and more than I could have hoped for, but the Lord answered my prayers that her young life might be consecrated to the Lord's service in China. She later went through her training in England as a nurse, and is now in China as a missionary of the China Inland Mission. The summer holidays at Peitaiho were drawing to a close. Heavy rains had fallen, making the roads to the station 6 miles distant almost impassable. Word had come that our 2 children, Ruth and Wallace, must leave by the Monday morning train in order to reach the steamer at Tientsin, which was to take them to Chefoo, where they were attending the China Inland Mission schools. All day Saturday and Sunday torrents of rain continued to fall, with a fierce wind from the north. I rose before daybreak Monday morning to find the rain still pouring down in torrents. I roused the servant and sent him off to make sure about the chair, cart, and donkeys. A little later he returned to say that the chair had been blown over, and the chair bearers had refused to come. The carters also refused, saying the roads were impassable, and even the donkey boys said they would not go. I was truly at wit's end corner. I went alone, and did not take time even to kneel down, but just lifted up my heart to my Father to stop the rain and open a way for our children to get to the station. I felt a sudden strong confidence that the Lord would help, and going out again I ordered the servant to run fast to the village nearby and get fresh donkeys. He was unwilling, saying it was useless, no one would venture, but I said, "Go at once, I know they will come." When he was gone, the children had their breakfast, boxes were closed and taken out, and the children put on their wraps. Then the rain stopped. Just then the servant returned with several donkeys. Within 5 minutes the children and baggage were on donkeys and started for the station. A few hours later one of the donkey boys returned with a hastily written note from Ruth, saying they had reached the station without any mishap, and quite dry, for it had not rained on the way over, but had started to pour again just after they got on the train. The rain continued for days after. At the close of our 4 months of meetings in Great Britain in 1910, I felt a strong desire to send a gift of $5 to 5 different objects in Britain, to show in a practical way our sympathy with the workers in these various branches of the Lord's work. My husband was in the midst of his accounts when I asked him to give me £5 for this purpose. He told me it was impossible, as we had barely enough for the journey to China. As I left him, I wondered why I seemed to have these gifts so definitely laid upon me to send away, when there was no money. Reasoning that if the thing were really of the Lord, he could himself give me what he wished me to send, I put the matter from my mind. That evening's mail brought a letter from a stranger living some distance away, judging from the postmark, for the letter had no address and was not signed. The letter said, "I do not know you, nor have I met you, but the Lord seems to have laid it on my heart to send you this £5 note as a farewell gift, to do what you think best with." It was with a joyful heart I sent off the gifts to the 5 Christian workers in Britain. Had the giver said it was for work in China, as it was usually the case, I could not have used it for any other purpose. How to get the sewing done for my family, and yet meet the pressing calls made upon me as the wife of a pioneer missionary for almost 30 years, has been, perhaps, the most difficult and constant problem of my missionary life. In connection with the solving of this problem I have seen some of the most precious evidences of God's willingness to undertake in the daily details of life. The following story must be given in detail to be really understood, as one of the striking instances of how God in his own wonderful way can work out the seemingly impossible. Returning home to our station from an unusually strenuous autumn's touring, I planned as usual to give the month of December to the children's sewing, so as to leave January largely free for a Bible woman's training class. But my health broke down, and I could make scarcely any headway with the 35 or 40 garments which had been made or fixed over before the children returned to their school in Gifu. By the 18th of December we decided to cancel the class on account of my ill health, and to all the women except one whom I entirely forgot I sent word not to come. As the days passed, the burden of almost untouched sewing became very great. At last I cried to the Lord to undertake for me, and how wonderfully he did. On December 28th, when I was conducting the Chinese women's prayer meeting, I noticed in the audience Mrs. Lu, the very woman to whom I had forgotten to send word. She had come a long distance with her little child over rough mountainous roads, so I felt very sorry for my thoughtlessness. Mrs. Lu accompanied me home, and I gave her money for a barrow on which to return the next day. I then sat down to the sewing machine. The woman stood beside me for a little, and then said, "You are looking very tired, Mrs. Goforth. Let me run the machine for you." "You!" I exclaimed, astonished. "Why, you don't know how." "Yes, I do," she replied. She was so insistent that at last, in fear and trembling, I ventured to let her try, for I had only one needle. It took but a few moments to convince me she was a real expert at the machine. When I urged her to stay and help me, she replied that since the class was given up she would return home on the morrow. That night I was puzzled. Why should the Lord lead this woman to me, the only one, so far as we knew, who could do the machine work, and then permit her to leave? I could only lay the whole matter before the Lord and trust him to undertake. And again he answered. That night a fierce storm came on, lasting several days, and making the roads quite impassable. Mrs. Lu, finding herself storm-tied, gladly gave all her time to me. The roads remained impassable for a whole month. during which time I did not once need to sit down at the machine. While in Tientsin with my children during the revolution in 1912, I had occasion to go into the Chinese city with my servant. We visited 3 stores. On our way home by the tramway I discovered I had lost a $5 bill and one of my gloves. I had foolishly put the bill inside the glove. Ashamed to let the Chinese servant know of my carelessness, I sent him home when we reached the end of the train line. As soon as he was out of sight I took the tram back to the city. On the way I confessed to the Lord my carelessness, and asked him to keep the glove and money and lead me to where they were. I retraced my steps back to 2 of the stores where we had been. As I entered the second, which was a shoe store, a number of men were in the shop, but there, right in sight of all, on the floor lay my glove. I knew, of course, with the $5 inside. It was with a heart full of gratitude to my loving Father and an enlarged vision of his love that I picked up the glove and returned home that day. On one occasion, when on furlough with several little children and my husband in China, I had no settled home. When the time came to do the sewing for the long journey back to China, I had simply no way to get it done. I just had to look to the Lord, and, as so often before, he was again faithful and opened the way. When shopping downtown one day, I met a minister's wife from a distant country charge, who said, "I want you to come with all your children and get your sewing done with me. A number of the ladies of our congregation sew well, and we will be delighted to help you." I gratefully accepted her invitation, and while staying with her a sewing bee was held in the church. In 1 week the sewing was finished, which would have taken me many weeks of hard, constant labor to accomplish alone. The winter of our return from China, after the Boxer tragedies, I felt keenly the need of a good sewing machine, as I could not possibly do the children's sewing by hand and still get time for meetings. One day, as my husband was leaving on a deputation tour, I asked him for money for a machine. He assured me it was impossible, that we had only sufficient for bare necessities. I knew well he would gladly give me the money for the machine if he had it. So I laid my need before the Father, confident that he knew it was a real need, and that according to his promise he could and would supply it. I was so sure that somehow the money would come, that I went downtown especially to choose a suitable machine. I found it would cost $36. A few days later I received a letter from a band of ladies in Mount Forest, Ontario, enclosing $23 and some odd cents, saying, "Please accept the enclosed to buy something you have lost as our substitute in China." Only a day or 2 later another letter came from quite another part of Ontario, enclosing $12 and some cents. The 2 amounts came to exactly the sum I needed to purchase the machine. The second letter stated that the money was sent to help me buy a sewing machine. It has always been a puzzle to me how they came to send the money in that way, for I had not spoken to anyone but my husband about wanting a machine. When Mr. Goforth returned, I was able to show him what the Lord could give me, though he could not. I had been holding a class for women at an outstation, staying in the home of the elder Dr. Fan. The day before I was to return home, Mrs. Fan asked me to go with her to visit a very sick boy whom the missionary doctor had sent home from the boys' school, Wee Hui, because of his having tuberculosis of the lungs. Mrs. Fan told me the mother was in great distress, and begged me to come and pray with her. I found the lad in a truly pitiable condition. His mouth was swollen, his face a ghastly hue, and every moment a cough racked his frame. He seemed to me quite beyond hope, and looked as if he could not live long. On our way home to Mrs. Fan's, the message of James 5:14 and 15 kept coming persistently to me, as if spoken by a voice. "Is any sick among you? Let him call for the elders of the church, and let them pray over him. And the prayer of faith shall save the sick, and the Lord shall raise him up." I simply could not get away from those words. On reaching Dr. Fan's home, I sent for him, and asked if he and the other elders would be willing to pray with me over the lad. He consented, though at first he seemed rather dubious. There were quite a number of Christians gathered around as we placed the boy in our midst. All knelt down, and I read the words from James. I told them plainly that I could not say that it was indeed the Lord's will to heal the boy. All that was clear to me was that we must obey as far as we had light, and leave the rest in God's hands for life or death. Several prayed, and we then dispersed. Early the following morning I left for home. Circumstances prevented my return to that place, and in time we moved to another field. More than 2 years later, while visiting Wei Hui, I met Mrs. Fan, who told me that the lad had completely recovered and was then working with his father. Still a year later I met Dr. Fan, and upon inquiring about the lad the doctor told me he was perfectly well and was in business in Wei Hui City. The power of intercession is shown in the following two incidents. In the winter of 1905 a call came for my husband to hold special meetings in Manchuria. On following Liu Yang for these meetings, one of the missionaries showed him a letter from Mr. Moffat of Korea, which said, "I have 1,000 Christians here who have promised to pray for Mr. Goforth, and I know their prayers will prevail with God." Can we doubt that their prayers had something to do with the marvelous revival movement which followed? When in England in 1909, my husband was the guest of a lady in London who was noted for her power of intercession. He was telling her of the great revival movements he had been through, which took place in different provinces of China, and she asked him to look at her diary, in which were notes of times when she had been led out in special intercession for Mr. Goforth. These dates exactly corresponded to the times of the greatest revival power. A few months after we returned to China from a furlough, I invited a certain missionary and his wife and children to pay us a visit. Peculiarly touching circumstances had led me to give this invitation. Both husband and wife were in ill health and greatly needed a change. They resided in a fair inland station, quite cut off from other missionaries. They were not connected with any society, and were looking only to the Lord for their support. Just as these friends had started toward us on their 5 days' journey, smallpox broke out in our station, and one of the missionaries died. A telegram was sent, hoping to catch them before they left, but it did not reach them until they were a short distance from our station. Then the whole family had to turn around, and once more take the long, trying journey homeward. As the weather was very cold at the time, one could imagine what a terrible trial to faith the whole experience meant to them. I felt so deeply for them that I planned to send sufficient to cover at least the expense of the journey. But, on getting out of quarantine, I found I could not draw on our treasurer for the $50 needed, as Mr. Goforth was not at home. However, the Lord had seen the need long before I felt it, and had the exact amount ready. 3 days after I got out of quarantine I received a letter from Mr. Horace Govan, of the Faith Mission, Glasgow, enclosing a draft for £5, which, at the rate of exchange at that time, came to $50 Mexican. The gift came from the workers of the mission, and he stated that they wished me to accept it as a personal gift. Needless to say, the draft was sent off that same day to the needy friends in the far-off station. On one occasion, when we were temporarily stationed at Wei Hui, Honan, I was called to nurse a fellow missionary who had contracted black smallpox. This missionary died, and it was while shut away from every one during the time of quarantine that I had the following experience. I awoke suddenly one night, feeling greatly troubled for one in Canada. So strong was the impression that this friend needed my prayers that I felt compelled to rise and spend a long time wrestling with God on this one's behalf. Then peace came, and I again slept. As soon as I was out of quarantine I wrote to my friend and told of this experience, giving the date. In time the answer came, which said that, though no date could be given, as no note had been made of it, as far as could be judged it was about the same time that I had had the burden of prayer; that my friend was passing through a time of such temptation as seemed almost overwhelming. But the letter said, "I was brought through victoriously. I know that it was your prayers that helped me." The following incident may seem trifling to some, but to me no answer in my life ever brought more intense relief. For this reason I have reserved it as the final testimony of the original prayer record. My husband had gone to hold revival meetings in a distant province, and while he was away I went with my Bible woman to a certain outstation, at the urgent request of the Christians, to preach at a 4 days' theatrical, which brought great crowds. The 4 days there were enough to wear out the strongest. For many hours daily we had to fence unruly crowds coming and going, and at the end of our stay I turned my face homeward, utterly worn out. My one thought was to get to Wee Hui, our next station, for a few days' rest with my youngest children, who were attending school there. A sight of them, I knew, would recover my energies better than anything else. But in getting home I in some way lost the key of the money drawer. It was Friday, and the train for Wee Hui left on Saturday at 10 o'clock. Different persons came for money, but I had to put them off with some excuse. There was too much money in the drawer for me to leave with the key lying around somewhere. Besides, I myself could not go without money. As soon as I had my supper I started searching everywhere. Drawers, pigeonholes, shelves, were all searched in vain. After hunting for 2 hours until I was too exhausted to hunt any more, I suddenly thought, I have never prayed about it. Stopping still, just where I stood by the dining table, I lifted my heart to the Lord. "O Lord, you know how much I need a rest. You know how much I long to see the children. Pity me and lead me to the key." Then, without wasting a step, I walked through the dining room, hall, and women's guest room into Mr. Goforth's study, to the bookcase, which covers one side of the room, opened the door, slipped 2 books aside, and there was the key. So near did the Lord seem at that moment that I could almost feel his bodily presence. It was not that I remembered putting the key there, but he led me there. Yes, I know God answers prayer. End of chapter 8. Our God of the Impossible.